China's map triggers strong reactions from India and from other Chinese neighbors. How much of this is a part of a larger strategy for land grab, and what does it mean for bilateral ties? Will the map coming days after Modi-Xi meeting and days before the G20 summit actually mean more trouble for the India-China relationship ahead? Hello and welcome to Worldview at The Hindu with me, Suhasini, Haidar. Up ahead, we will speak to The Hindu's China correspondent, Anand Krishnan, to decode much of this. But first, let's just tell you what happened. Last week, we had spoken about what seemed like a détente in India-China ties after Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping met on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in South Africa. But any idea of progress was punctured shortly after. Within a day, New Delhi and Beijing were at odds over just what had transpired in the talks, with both sides offering separate accounts of the discussion on the boundary and what had been agreed upon. They even differed over who had initiated the meeting, as China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs claimed that Prime Minister Modi requested it, while the MEA said India had asked for the meeting but had rejected the Chinese request for a formal, structured bilateral meeting instead. So the two leaders met on a sofa in the leaders' lounge right outside the BRICS summit. Then 3 days later, China issued this new map. It called it the Standard Map of 2023, and it showed boundaries reaching far beyond China's own into that of its neighbors. On the Indian boundary, claiming Indian territory, including all of Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin. The Ministry of External Affairs lodged a strong protest, it called it, with China over the map, which had been put out by China's Ministry of Natural Resources as a part of an annual exercise. External Affairs Minister Jaishankar called China's claims in the map absurd. Listen in.
China has even in the past put out maps which claim the territories which are not China's, which belong to other countries. This is an old habit of theirs. It is not something which is new. It started in the 1950s. So just by putting out a map claiming territories, some of which are part of India, I think doesn't make that. These are very much part of India. So I would say, but I would not relate the two countries. I think we are very clear. We are very clear what our territories are. This government is very clear about what we need to defend our territories. You can already see that on our borders. I think there should be no doubt about that. Just making absurd claims doesn't make other people's territory yours.
But it wasn't just India. Protests came in from Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and also Taiwan's foreign ministry, as China had claimed in that map about 90% of the South China Sea, and put in a 10-dash line, not a 9-dash line as it often does, south of what is called Hainan Island, that cuts into the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, the maritime sphere of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. So a lot of protests coming from many of those countries. China's response to all of this was unrelenting. It said this was a routine event. It called on countries to view the map in an objective and rational light, and even telling them to stay calm and not over-interpret the map. Clearly, that is not likely to make people stay calm, but a week ahead, more has happened. The G20 summit is now just a week away in India, and there's still no confirmation of Xi Jinping's visit to Delhi. And reports are indicating that he will skip the summit and send his premier Li Qiang in his place. Now, this would be another blow to bilateral ties, as it indicates China downgrading its presence at the summit, and could mean less movement in forging a joint statement at the end of the summit. Remember, Indonesia, G20 in 2022, Xi Jinping did go there. Now, I spoke to the Hindu's China correspondent, Anand Krishnan, about what the map portends really for India. And I began by asking him why, if this was a routine occurrence, an annual occurrence, that it had triggered off such a strong response and alarm.
Well, Suhasini, it's true that it is the same Chinese map that they've been putting out in previous years as well, and there's no new territorial claims as such. But I think it's certainly unhelpful given the timing, given everything that's been going on between India and China, the fact that we are in year three of an unresolved LAC crisis. And we should also remember, Suhasini, when India put out a map in 2019 without changing its external borders, following the reorganization in Kashmir and the creation of Ladakh Union Territory, the fact that the external borders were the same, it didn't have China, calm in any way at all, and Beijing was furious. So I think that maps always trigger sensitivity. I think even if it's true that it's a restatement of China's claims, I think what should worry India is the fact that under Xi Jinping in the last couple of years, China is more forcefully sort of enforcing claims, even if the claims are the same. The way Beijing is going about making them and enforcing them is something that is causing a lot of tension with India and other countries as well.
It is, as you said, part of a pattern of actions by the Chinese government. Many analysts have been speaking more and more about what is called the three warfare strategy. I think it's quite old, but it seems to be more and more in the fore. Can you explain this to us, Anant, what exactly it means and what repercussions it could have?
Absolutely. And I think there is reason to situate this in terms of that because it refers to, for example, China using psychological warfare, information tactics, as well as legal means in terms of the way it approaches disputes with other countries and the way it justifies its stand, even if other countries may question how legal those means are. And I think we've seen that, I think, taken to another level by the Xi Jinping government. I would sort of point people to the new border law that was passed in 2022. And I think that actually, I don't think it's a coincidence that this new map followed the border law because one of the articles of the border law pushes all governments, ministries, departments, state governments in China to kind of educate people about China's borders and about China's history and about China's sovereignty issues. So this is something that's sort of filtering down through the Chinese system. So I think it has domestic political repercussions in China where it ensures that everybody sort of sticks to the script. And it does have external implications as well, because what the Chinese are saying to other countries is, look, this is our own laws require us to enforce our territorial claims, and we aren't going to change that.
Right. And particularly the parts of the border law that talk about where populations are, there the boundary has to be extended and asserted. And I do want to ask you, about, you'd earlier talked about the timing of this publication here in India. Of course, the timing seemed to come just days after the meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping there in South Africa, where the two sides came away with what seemed like conflicting readouts. Is there more to the message behind the timing, given that there's the G20 coming up, or is this just a coincidence that the publication of this map was now?
So, Asni, I would say I'm leaning towards it being coincidental, even though you never know with China. And I only say that because I was looking at Chinese media reports about why this map was released. And it turns out that they've been organizing this campaign in southern China, in Zhejiang province, and they've been celebrating something called National Map Publicity Awareness Week, which sounds very catchy. And so it's something that I think they've been preparing. The Ministry of Natural Resources is the one that's been handling this sort of map publicity campaign in China. So I would say that it's unlikely that it's related to the bilateral sort of conversation, the brief conversation that we had at BRICS. And I would also not be entirely sure if it's related to G20 because it's not only directed at India, it's also South China Sea, it's also Taiwan. But having said that, Suhasini, I wouldn't downplay its importance only because I think it speaks to a broader trend, recent trend in China that we should all sort of pay attention to, which is, as I mentioned before, this emphasizing of national sovereignty. And I think what it does is it greatly narrows the scope for resolving disputes with countries in an equal footing or through dialogue or through past bilateral agreements, which China now seems to be putting on the back burner. Because what Beijing is saying is when it comes to things they look at as their national sovereignty, everything else is second fiddle. And I think we've seen that play out with the LAC as well, where a number of agreements that both sides have signed in the early 90s seem to have been rendered largely meaningless now because of Beijing deciding to go and enforce its territorial claims.
Our correspondent Anant Krishnan there. Now, the Indian map controversy that Anant was referring to dates back to November 2019, when India published a new map post Article 370 moves in Jammu and Kashmir that spurred protests not just from China and Pakistan, which were probably expected, but also from Nepal. And that was a controversy that snowballed. So what is the three warfare strategy? Before we go further, let me just tell you a bit about that. A strategy, the three warfare strategy, is a strategy that dates back to the 1960s, and particularly to Mao's contention that the PLA, rather than being a national military, is actually an instrument of establishing revolutionary political power. So actually working much more for the party as well as the government and the nation. In 1963, this was actually put into the PLA's own guidelines. In 2003, the three warfares was mentioned in what is called the Political Work Guidelines of the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, a document that was revealed not straight away, but internationally over time. So what were the three warfare strategies outlined? One, public opinion warfare. Two, psychological warfare, which is also called propaganda. And the third, legal warfare. Now, the threats where this warfare was to be used were both internal as well as external. Internally, to combat separatist groups in Xinjiang and in Tibet, quell dissent in Hong Kong, increase rhetoric on reunification of Taiwan, and externally with land and maritime neighbors. This was also then spelt out in the National Security Law of 2015 that really had an all-encompassing view of what threats to China's national security were. In 2022, China then enforced a new land border law that mandates that the party, government and PLA would enforce all border claims and assert territory claimed in maps, but also by population. So where there were villages along the boundary, then China would assert its claim over there as well. It also passed a Coast Guard law that authorized firepower to defend its maritime territory. So all of these have successively increased China's assertive capability, what's called cartographic aggression. So what must India watch out for diplomatically and militarily in the next few months? In the immediate future, the G20 summit next week, if China, along with Russia, refuses to budge, there may be no joint statement or leaders' declaration at that summit. And that would be the first time the G20 has failed to forge one. So India must watch China's moves over here very closely. If she does not attend, a Chinese president, another opportunity for Prime Minister Modi and the Chinese president to meet will present itself at the APEC summit, November 14th to 16th in San Francisco. Now, India has a special invitee there, but it remains to be seen if both leaders do go and if both leaders do meet over there. Boundary talks have now extended beyond the 19th round without a resolution. More tensions between India and China on other fronts could definitely cause more hostilities at the LAC in Ladakh. With the Chinese map usurping all of Arunachal Pradesh, that becomes a very particular point of concern for the military to watch out for. So the 2020 LAC standoff that began seems to be still with no resolution. Meanwhile, China-Bhutan boundary talks are actually progressing and picking up pace, with the first China-Bhutan meeting on boundary delimitation that was held last week. Any deal between them on Bhutan's western front could, of course, also increase India's vulnerabilities both in Sikkim and the Siliguri corridor that connects to the northeast. And finally, and maybe people don't watch this very closely, but elections are on over the next few months, in fact, within the next year in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. In fact, Taiwan also is expecting elections in January 2024. So it's a politically vulnerable time in India's neighborhood and also as a result in China's neighborhood. So what's Worldview's take on all this? In today's era of growing geopolitical tensions, a map is no longer just a two-dimensional paper with lines on it. It's an indicator of a country's intentions and its imagination of its own frontiers. In that sense, Beijing's decision to publish this map through a routine annual exercise must be read closely with the Chinese moves on the LAC and the maritime sphere, including military exercises, transgressions, building of permanent infrastructure, and border villages. India too must realize the importance of its own map-making exercises and ensure no surprises for diplomatic ties with its neighbors. Now let's get you some worldview reading recommendations, and there really are so many, so I'm going to try and get you the latest books first on China. In particular, this one's called Backlash, How China's Aggression Has Backfired by Helen Raleigh. I actually read it online. The Kindle edition is quite easy to get. Then this new book called The Party of One. It's The Rise of Xi Jinping and China's Superpower Future by Chun Han Wang. Inside the Mind of Xi Jinping by Francois Bougon. Both of these books very worth reading to get a real read of the situation today under Xi Jinping. Now, Anant actually did give me some recommendations, including the next two, China's New Red Guards, The Return of Radicalism and the Rebirth of Mao Zedong by Jude Blanchett, and of course the comparisons between Mao and the Xi era. Then there's this one on the economy called Making Sense of China's Economy. This is by Tao Wang, more academic work. A book on strategy that is quite an easy read and quite interesting, The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order, Bridging the Gap, he puts in brackets. This is by Rush Doshi. And then there's China After Mao, The Rise of a Superpower by Frank Dikötter. And I've spoken about Mr. Dikötter before. He wrote How to Be a Dictator, but this one is really about China in many chapters, spanning really the history of the last few decades. Another book, well worth reading, a lot of essays from very, very renowned experts and authors. Will China's Rise Be Peaceful? The Rise of a Great Power in Theory, History, Politics, and the Future. It's been edited by Asley Tohe, but as I said, several very well-known writers. The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China. This is by former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He is now Australia's ambassador to the United States. Then this book called Xi Jinping's Chinese Dream, China's Renewed Foreign and Security Policy. It's a Routledge book. It's written by a scholar from the Institute of Defense Strategic Analysis, Prashant Kumar Singh, and really is worth reading and very up-to-date, actually. Another few books by Indians, Understanding the India-China Border, The Enduring Threat of War in the High Himalayas by Manoj Joshi. I've spoken about this before. And of course, India's China Challenge, A Journey Through China's Rise and What It Means for India by Anant Krishnan himself. Two more books, How China Sees India and the World by Shyam Saran. Again, I've spoken about this book before. And The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate by Vijay Gokhale. Both of them are former foreign secretaries, experts on China as well. So we hope you have a lot of reading planned for yourself. And do join us again here on Worldview. If you're watching us on YouTube, please do like and subscribe to the Hindus YouTube channel from the team here. Thanks for watching.